Welcome, everyone. I am Sherry Trimble, one of the museum educators here at the State Museum of Pennsylvania, hosting our Learn at Lunchtime program. I will be monitoring the Q&A box. And I am joined today with my colleague, Dr. Curt Miner, who is the Senior History Curator at the State Museum, and he will be sharing Levittown at 70 today. Curt, turning it over to you.
Okay, so I was really pleased to be asked to talk about Levittown, which is an exhibit um, that it was part of it was the focus of an exhibit I had curated back in 2002. It was titled Levittown Building the Suburban Dream. And the exhibit was intended to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the opening of Levittown, Pennsylvania in Bucks County. We joked in 2002 that Levittown, which kind of is the epitome of these brand new post-war suburbs, had entered middle age. It's now, I guess, in 2022, an active retiree. It's now pulling Social Security, I guess, but it is still alive and still well. You're looking at a kind of classic view of Levittown that was you saw quite often in the 1950s, an aerial view from probably about the late or mid to late 1950s. The development has not yet been completed, but it's close to completion. Levittown is a brand name. It's clearly sort of the best known suburb, and it's the best known of actually three purpose-built suburbs after World War II. But it was actually part of a much broader mass movement. When we think of internal migrations in American history, I think people often think of the 19th century and people moving west and the gold rush. Those are clearly very important, significant social patterns put in place. But actually, the move to the suburbs after World War II is regarded as the largest internal migration in American history, not to a type of frontier, a crabgrass frontier, as one historian quipped back in several decades ago when doing one of the earliest histories of post-war suburbanization. That unprecedented movement was stimulated by a pent-up demand for affordable housing, something which is, as we all know, something of a recurrent theme, and we're going through it right now. But that demand that led to the post-war suburbs was fueled very specifically by returning World War II veterans who had two things with them. They had young families in tow, that soon to be known baby boom. They also had something else very important, the GI Bill, which was the technical name for that was the 1944 Servicemen's Adjustment Act. It's probably best known for providing veterans with educational benefits, but it also came with mortgage benefits, especially specifically government-backed low-cost mortgages. That was the demand. The supply and the supplier was this fellow, Bill Levitt. He was the most prolific home builder in the United States, certainly in July of 1950, which is when he landed on the cover of Time magazine. It was estimated that Bill Levitt was responsible, even in 1950, for 1 out of every homes being built in the United States. It's an interesting story about how he came to occupy this position, because the firm that he was part of, he was a principal in, had been started in the 1920s as a somewhat nondescript home builder. It was Levitt and Sons. Over on the left-hand side of the image, you'll see it was principled by Abraham Levitt, the father, in the lower left, Bill Levitt behind him, and to Abraham's right was the second brother, Alfred Levitt, who was sort of the in-house architect. They started off on Long Island, and they for many years built homes the old-fashioned way. They were custom built from start to finish. And there's an example of one of their houses on the right for an upper middle class customer base, as was customary at that point. That all changed in 1941 when the firm of Levitt and Sons received a defense contract for building 2,200 housing units in Norfolk, Virginia. They had to do it quickly. So they had to find a new technique. And this is where Levitt made his mark. It's how to build houses quickly and cheaply. He did it for the Defense Department when they needed defense housing. It was so successful, he thought, why not transition this from defense needs to the current needs, which is in the private home building market. So in 1947, he launches his first housing development on Long Island, which he names after himself. He builds 17,000 houses in about 3 years. At the time when it was completed, it was the largest housing development ever produced by a single builder. How did he do it? Well, there's a lot of different ways he did this, but clearly one way that he was able to achieve this astonishing production was in simplifying home building. And one way he did that was by simply producing smaller houses that all were using fairly similar types of materials. The first Levittown epitomized what came to be known as the cookie cutter suburb, mass produced. Levitt offered only 2 housing types. I'm only showing you one here because the other one looked pretty much exactly like this one. There's very little variation, but it allowed for an economy of scale. The first houses were about 750 square feet. So these are the original, if you will, tiny houses, which have become popular in recent years. They were all built on concrete slabs. And most importantly, they were a success, despite the fact that early critics said that it all looked the same. And even, quote, the mailmen get lost in Levittown. After Levittown 1 was completed, the firm decides they have a winning formula, and they decide to look for another location. And I'm showing you this map just to give you a sense of where Levittown 1 is. It's on Long Island, where you see New York. Levittown 2 is going to be in Pennsylvania, and the firm spends a few months scouting out a location, and they come up with an ideal location along the Delaware River in Lower Bucks County, ironically enough, very close to William Penn's first home, and in Bristol Township. And they figure that this is an ideal location because, first of all, it's equidistant to Philadelphia in the southwest and Trenton in the northeast, so 2 major population areas. In 1951, they decided to go ahead and begin purchasing property, and they managed to purchase, and this is important, 5,700 contiguous acres of farmland in Bucks County. What this photo of that area does not show is the proximity to a very large U.S. steel plant, which would become known as a Fairless Works, which had broken ground that same year. And it's very close by and would become the 12th largest steel mill in the country, another draw, a major employer. The Levittown 2, like Levittown 1, would go up very quickly. Construction began in April of 1952. And I think this cartoon captures in a very much of a nutshell the process, the immediate clearing of the land, and as you see, a kind of caricature clearly of how quickly the houses were then constructed on site. But the other reason I wanted to show you this cartoon is because I think it captures a sentiment that was very popular among intellectuals and elites, as we would call them today. There was no love for these mass-produced suburbs. In fact, Lewis Mumford, who was one of the most trenching critics of Levitt and his formula, described these new places, which were epitomized by Levittown, as representing, quote, a multitude of uniform, unidentifiable houses lined up inflexibly at uniform distances on uniform roads and a treeless communal waste inhabited by people of the same class, the same income, the same age group, witnessing the same television performances, eating the same tasteless prefabricated foods from the same freezers, conforming in every outward and inward respect to the common mold. Wow, that is a mouthful. Was there a kernel of truth to that? Perhaps. These were mass produced. This is a photograph of an early Levittown section What I want you to note here is the outline of the streets and these white blocks, which are actually concrete slabs. Levitt did not dig basements. Why? Because that cost money. It would have cost more money to do so. It would have slowed it down. Nobody was doing that in 1950, but by 1952, 25% of houses in the United States were being built on slabs. It was a quick way to produce a house. So Levitt was all about mass production, but he did it in a very different kind of way than we think of mass production, especially assembly line production. He delivered materials to the job sites, these individual slabs, in a very ingenious way. All the materials were portioned out in house size amounts. That means everything from the sidings to the nails. These are all in perfectly calibrated portions, and they were pre-cut. Nobody had to saw anything on site. These prefabricated elements also included kitchen appliances, which is very important in Levittown. It's a big part of the sell. The other thing that Levitt did is goes along with this. He broke down the house building process into over 100 discrete tasks. Prior to Levitt coming along in this mass production that he didn't necessarily invent, but he certainly mastered, houses were built one at a time. He broke this process into component parts, much like he would have been assembling an automobile, and each task was then assigned to a specific task that had to be completed, such as siding and painting and laying the linoleum floor and installing the heat tubes into the slab itself. This was assembly line production, but it was an assembly line that was inverted. And you think of the classic assembly line with a belt, the products on the belt, and it goes down to workers who are stationary. It worked inverted in this sense, because workers, instead of being fixed in one place, they traveled to the location of the project, and they did what they needed to do to complete their part of the task. It was estimated that as this process became finely tuned by Levitt, a house was being produced every 16 minutes. And at its peak of production, Levitt was turning out 40 to 50 houses per day, which is rather remarkable. And this is a section, the first handful of sections that are completed in Levittown. It's an aerial view. In April 1953, again, just a little bit over a year after they started they've turned out 4,000 houses. By July of 1954, 9,000 houses. This leads Bill Levitt to say, "We are not builders, we are manufacturers." Having said that, Bill Levitt was a man with a large ego. He did not want to simply be known as a manufacturer. He said something to the effect that any fool can put up a bunch of houses. He wanted to build a community that he could be proud of. And he took a lot of heat for the first Levittown for being kind of piecemeal and not having a whole lot of variety and not being the most pleasant place to live in. So he came to Levittown, Pennsylvania with this idea that he would build, quote, the most perfectly planned community in the United States, which was a pretty tall order, but he thought he had the plan for this. The key was to organize these 17,000 houses. Levittown 2 in Bucks County would be built basically to the same scale as the first Levittown, but it would be organized quite differently. He broke these 17,000 houses into 40 sections, each between either 100 or up to 500 houses each, which were then organized into what he called master blocks. And what you're seeing here is a diagram of one of those master blocks, and it shows you how these sections or neighborhoods would work in relationship to each other and to the centerpiece, which was always a school and some kind of recreation or community activity, as you see here. And that sort of formed the nucleus. Levittown, as one would expect, was highly dependent on the automobile. You had to drive there, and you had to drive there once you got there. It was estimated that there were 97 miles of roads that crisscrossed Levittown. At the same time, Levitt did not want Levittown 2 to be a slave to the automobile. So though it could have been built on a grid, he built it with curvilinear streets to break up the sight lines and the slow traffic. And he had thoroughfares that he called parkways. You see that on the right-hand sign here that were intensively landscaped. And I should also add this, there were no streets in Levittown. He called them roads and lanes, and that was quite intentional. He wanted to give Levittown a kind of pastoral feel, at least in name, if not in look, ultimately. Um, of course, the key to Levittown for most people was a house, and here's where Levittown 2 really took off. Instead of 2 different types of houses, he had 6. Um, this is the first one. It was a Levittowner, which was a ranch-style house. Each house model came in 4 different styles. Each one of those styles was cosmetically different from the other one, so it was sort of more of an appearance of diversity. There's a different orientation to the street with each style of house within a model, and a different exterior color as well. In 1953, after the Levittowner, he introduced a rancher, which inscrutably enough was actually not a ranch house, but a 2-story house. That was at the low end. It was $1,000 cheaper than the Levittowner. He also had a country clubber, he called it, which was at the high end, and that's in the lower right. And then he introduced by 1954 the Jubilee, which was kind of a middling house type that was sold for about $11,000 or $12,000. This led Levitt to boast that he had, quote, the least monotonous mass housing group in the country, which is kind of damning it with faint praise, but it was all relative, I suppose. In December 1951, Levitt opens the Levittown 2 for sale. 30,000 people converge on the sales office of Levittown in Lower Bucks County to look through one of 3 model homes, which are built right across from the train station in Tullytown. The starting price is $9,900. What they saw inside was something they'd never seen before, a modern design on an open plan with a central hearth, which incidentally enough was inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright, because Alfred Levitt, the architect, was a student of Wright and really wanted to make Wright's style of house available to the masses. It boasted indoor-outdoor living. There were patios. It had large picture windows, which you can see in the lower right. And perhaps most importantly, it had a fully equipped modern electric kitchen and range and refrigerator, etc. 300 houses were sold that first weekend. In less than 2 months, 3,000 units were sold. By May of 1952, the first year's production had been sold out. The vast majority of those sales had used VA loans in order to procure the sale. In June of 1952, the first 20 families arrived. Most are couples under 30, children under the age of 5. It's said that they came with a suitcase in one hand and a baby in another. This is a view from one of the really only high spots in Levittown. Again, it's built along that kind of coastal plain in southeastern Pennsylvania, and it shows, a kind of idyllic family looking down on the development. By the mid-1950s, Levitt is still building, but he's getting more competition from other builders who are basically copying what he's doing, but on a much smaller scale. So he's got to figure out how to continue to attract people to Levittown. And when we did this exhibit back in 2002, we spent a good deal of time talking to original homeowners, people who moved into Levittown between 1952 and 1958. And what they talked about, and most often, was this sense of community and neighborhood, which is interesting because Levittown was thought not to have those elements. But again, Levittown 2 was designed to accommodate neighborhoods and to grow neighborhoods around these common elements, namely schools and pools and so forth. This is a view of the lower section of Levittown. Lower left-hand corner, you see Stony Brook, which was the first section to go online. It was, if you look closely at this, you'll see that every street, or I should say lane, in any given section begins with the first letter, the same first letter, and the same first letter of the section, which is supposed to help people orient themselves through this massive sprawling suburb. Levittown had 8 elementary schools, One school was embedded inside each master block. This was so that every child could walk to school. That was really important. Every kid was within a half a mile of a school. They did not have to cross a major intersection. This was a baby boomer town. Walt Disney came to Levittown in 1955 to dedicate the first elementary school named in his honor, Walt Disney Elementary. It still survives today in Levittown. There were 5 community swimming pools. They were managed by a community group there called the Levittown Public Recreation League. They had baseball fields, and yes, Levittown excelled at Little League Baseball. And in 1960, a team from Levittown won the Little League World Series, appropriately enough. It also had, by 1954, something that did not exist in the first Levittown for certain, a shopping center. It was called the Shoporama. It opened in February of 54, was completed the next year, had space for 90 stores, 6,000 vehicles. It was touted as the largest pedestrian mall east of the Mississippi, and over time, it became Main Street. It was the place where you would go to see a beauty pageant like the Miss Levittown pageant, or you would go to hear a politician. And JFK and Richard Nixon both made appearances at Levittown in 1960 during their campaigns. Mumford and others were, as I said, highly critical of this new landscape form that was dotting the country, epitomized by Levittown. Suburbanites and suburbs looked the same. Well, in some ways that was true. They were all uniformly young with children in terms of the residents. Less than 4% of Levittown residents in 1955 were under the age of 45. That's rather remarkable. Within that, though, Levittown was quite diverse. An observer noted that the first Levittown in the 1950s was, quote, an unusual mix of liberal and conservative, Bronx-born Jew and Nanaco coal cracker, which gets at something because, it was when they did surveys of who was living in Levittown, they found, unsurprisingly, about half the people living there were from the Philadelphia metropolitan area. But another significant percentage, about 25%, were from coal and steel towns throughout the rest of Pennsylvania. It had, not surprisingly, as a result, a large Catholic population. Someone quipped that it might be better called Kensington North, Trenton South, or McKeesport East rather than simply Levittown. So on class and religion, Levittown during the 1950s was more diverse than the general population. However, in other categories, it did conform to the stereotype. Levittown did not receive its first Black residents until 1957. Bill and Daisy Myers, shown on the left, found a house in the Dogwood Hollow section on a resale. They move in, they're greeted by unruly mobs, to say the least, to the point where Pennsylvania Governor George Leader was forced to send the state police to restore law and order after the family was harassed by this large crowd that assembled every evening. The move of the Myers to Levittown, which incidentally is going to be the subject of an exhibit that's going to be opening in a few months here at the State Museum. It really did expose this Jim Crow in the North, a kind of Jim Crow that was practiced not necessarily by law, but by habit and custom. And it's interesting to note that the events in Levittown that summer of August 1957 played out on top of the events that were occurring in Little Rock, Arkansas, a much more famous integration effort for the Little Rock Nine to access public schools in Deep South. Again, Levitt refused to sell to blacks. That was a policy. As a private builder, he could do that. He was not bound by law. And his point was always, we can solve the housing issue or we can solve the race issue, but we cannot combine the two. The thinking being that if Levitt sold to African Americans, he could not sell to whites who would then leave town. So just to kind of quickly wrap up, what happens after that high point 1957? There's one more production year. Levitt introduces 2 additional houses, the Pennsylvanian in the lower left-hand corner, the Colonial in the upper right-hand corner. If you'll note, the model types are much more now kind of traditional. He went all in on modern with his first housing types, and kind of responded to the market, which was more interested in traditional homes, two-story homes in most cases. The final house slab for Levittown was laid in December of 1957 in the Twin Oaks section. It's the last of Levittown's neighborhoods. By 1967, but by 1960 rather, there were about 70,000 people living in Levittown. Had it been incorporated, it would have been in the top 10 of Pennsylvania places in terms of population. But that's a big if. Levittown was not incorporated, and that's a big part of its story. In fact, Levittown, after 1958, really begins to fragment after the builder pulls on and moves out to his pulls out and moves on to his next project. It kind of splits into its 4 existing municipalities that are shown here with this map. It's served by 3 different school districts, and perhaps most importantly, and this is sort of unanticipated, but it was kind of baked into Levittown. It ends up being highly stratified by social class, even though it's still overwhelmingly white. There's the working class or blue collar sections of Levittown, which are where the smallest houses are. They're all in the same sections, the Levittowners. And then there's the kind of the Tony end of Levittown, where the country clubbers, the high-end models are being built. And that really comes to define Levittown. And there's not one single Levittown. There's at least 4 and perhaps more when you get down to the neighborhood level. So Levittown today, what's changed? Well, that's a subject would be a subject of at least another program or 2. But it is a curious mix of past and present. This is an aerial view where you can still see the kind of the original footprint of Levitt's design with his sections and his curvilinear streets and his master blocks and so forth. But what's interesting, of course, is the landscape has filled in significantly. And the other important thing is, and probably most important, is that that identical looking, mass suburbia that Lewis Mumford was sneered at, that's not there. So many houses have been altered and made enlarged and just customized that it's really hard in some cases to locate an original Levittown house. We spent some time trying to find a house that had not been altered, and that was a nearly impossible task. The other thing I should say, and that and this is perhaps as much comment on the present as on the past, average home prices today in Levittown, and I had looked this up just out of curiosity recently, are $300,000, which is a far cry from the $8,900 asking price in 1953 for a ranch house. So that, in a nutshell, is Levittown at 70. I want to end very quickly by talking about one of my favorite pieces we collected in Levittown when we were doing this exhibit back in 2002. That's an original kitchen from a 1958 Jubilee. We would have loved to have had an original house that we could have pulled in and rebuilt into a museum, but none existed. However, a kitchen did. A wonderful couple we came to know, Jack and Sally Sundesky, happened to be remodeling after a 40-year wait, and called us just as we were beginning this project back in 2002 and said, "I hear you're doing an exhibit. How would you like an original 1958 Levittown kitchen?" We collected it in its entirety and constructed it for this exhibit. And it was a hit of the show, and it's still in our collections today. So with that, I thank you for listening, and happy to answer any questions you all might have.
All right, so we do have a couple of questions. And like I said, if you have more questions, please use the Q&A box here to add your questions. So one of the questions that came up were you had the variations on the different houses, but was the concrete slab the same across the board? So the basic floor print?
Yes, yeah, they were the same. They altered the size of the slabs depending on the house type. So that obviously the country clubber, which was the largest model offered and the most expensive at 18,000, I think, originally. That had a larger footprint and a slightly different configuration, but it was still on a slab. They all,
I guess
and
it does
with the
make
radiant
sense.
heat.
Oh, and yeah, so that was why I saw the pipes. And so do they all have radiant heat?
They all had radiant heat, which was cost saving, because where else can you put the heat if you don't have a basement? That was a cost saving measure, which worked for a while until it didn't work. And
Mhm.
a lot of people had to replace those pipes. So not everything held up as expected, but more held up than didn't, I would say, in terms of the construction techniques and the features of the house.
Were there any HOA, we have all these kind of restrictions that we have to do with improvements and standardization. Was any of that existing at the time
Yeah,
for him?
between 1952 and 1958, Levitt himself required homeowners to apply for any variances to him as a builder. The problem is, because uh, Levittown was not incorporated, it had no he had no he had no enforcement capability beyond making the sale, which had pluses and minuses. On the minus side, he was unable to enforce, for instance, rules he had regarding fences. He didn't want people to put fences up. They put them up anyway. He would say take them down. They would then appeal to the township, the residents that they might be living in. Again, they could be one of four. On the upside, Levitt um, refused to sell to African Americans, but as a result of the fact that he didn't have an incorporated place. If an individual homeowner wanted to sell to an African American, they could, which is exactly how Daisy Myers and Bill Myers were able to purchase. He would not sell to them, but an individual homeowner did.
Yeah, I am looking forward to the exhibit. I actually just popped down today to see the progress. So just stay tuned for June-ish. We'll be sending out lots of marketing on that one. All right. So you talked about how this community eventually started to affect other communities. Were there any like other larger builders, or they follow similar patterns to that?
As far as I know, Levitt was never eclipsed, by at least during the 1950s. There was a large builder out in California. I think Kaiser was his name, and he would kind of use something kind of similar formula out in California, but no one ever tried to duplicate the scale of Levitt. In fact, his third community, after he completes Levittown, Pennsylvania, he goes literally across the river into New Jersey and creates Levittown 3, but it's on a smaller scale. And he realizes there's really no value in building these large sprawling communities in terms of being able to make a lot of money. It was more of a headache for him to try to keep these communities coherent. So he kind of abandons that idea and really kind of continues to build developments, but nothing on the same scale as he has created. And as far as I know, there's no other developer that ever really decides there's any financial incentive to try to build on that scale in terms of creating a single community.
Mm-hmm. So of course, the communities, we talk about that. There's a couple of questions you talked about the religious communities, but was there like cultural communities that like they form like little clubs and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, Levittown was, as all these suburbs was considered like a highly extroverted. There's a highly extroverted culture in Levittown, that a lot of joiners. I mean, that's sort of part of the stereotype of these suburban communities. And there was, I remember when we put together our exhibit there, we found a calendar of events, a community calendar, and there were a lot of young families all of whom were from other places, although they, interestingly enough, reformed some places because so many of them were from the coal regions, or so many were from Western Pennsylvania steel towns. But Mostly no. They what's I guess the closest you would come to that. I'm not sure if I'm answering this question clearly, but is there were the Levitt provided space for churches, but he didn't build the churches.
Ah, okay.
He built schools. He built the swimming pools. He built the ball fields. The churches had to be built by the communities, and there were, interestingly enough, a couple of synagogues and a couple of Catholic churches, which again, I think hints at that a kind of ethnic and cultural diversity while still being very white within Levittown.
Is there a current historical society or group that's trying to maintain the history in Levittown?
As far as I know, there's actually at least one. There's when we were doing our exhibit, the most of the history of Levittown existed that was being retained was in the local public library. But now there's a couple of organizations that I know are interested in preserving history. There's an individual, a fellow named Dave Marable, who was who's now a retired school teacher, who, like a lot of people, kind of single-handedly was collecting a lot of Levittown history. And I don't know if he has, if I think he's interested, and it will show people his collection. There's certainly several online museums to Levittown, and there's a very large collection of Levittown material at the Bucks County Historical Society, also known as the Mercer Museum, and they've acquired a lot of stuff over the years as well.
So the church comment brought up a question. Did the church have to purchase the ground? Did he give the church the ground?
That's a great question. I knew the answer to that at one time. I think he allocated land for churches, how much he charged the churches for it, or if he just simply transferred the land over. I know that they were required, obviously, to finance the building of the church, but these were set asides in the very least. So he probably offered them to churches, if not for free, at a reduced rate. But that's a great question. I'd like to research that. Maybe I can get back to them on that, because I probably knew the answer to that at one time. I don't recall it.
I'm going to combine two questions, but this goes back to the original construction. So there's a question, because there's different zip codes, there's different municipalities, I'm assuming different farmers. So the purchasing of the land, was he having to divide, like, okay, did this take a while to combine all of these efforts?
From when my recollection is that the easy part was purchasing the land. Like, that was not he found it was I think it was specifically was in the asparagus and broccoli, and I admittedly can often confuse the farmland in Long Island with the farmland in Pennsylvania. But he was able, what he boasted that he had contiguous 5,700 contiguous acres that he had acquired. So that wasn't a problem, because it only took him about a year. I think the problem he ran into was once he started building, and then he realized, whoops, I'm dealing with 4 separate municipalities, each of which have different sets of rules, and it really dogged him. I recall that Middletown Township got to the point where they refused to grant him building permits, and they gave him a hard time. Middletown was very different from the other townships, and they had a much stricter building code, and he did not anticipate that. So he had to call an audible, as we would say, and he had to revise one of his building plans in order to accommodate that particular municipality. And he said, interestingly enough, he would never do that again. He would never build a development where he was not able to incorporate. I don't know. And I think ultimately what he did is he just scaled back his ambitions.
So, these kind of questions come up today because supply chain's like the big topic right now. So where were his suppliers? Where was he pulling?
Well, I left that slide out, but it's important to note, since I was making parallels between Levitt and implicitly Henry Ford, I talked about the assembly line. That's a Henry Ford idea. It's from the early industrial era or later industrial era. The other, so he borrowed the assembly line technique from Ford. He borrowed from the 19th century industrial titans this idea of vertical integration, which is a fancy word for saying he didn't have to worry about suppliers because he was his own supplier. He owned his own lumber yard.
Ah,
He made his own cement and concrete. He had his own concrete plant. So he made certain that he would not get hung up with that. And things that he couldn't produce himself, he entered into special contracts with, for instance, General Electric, which supplied his kitchens. And they had a very, very profitable relationship in the 1950s. So he did not have that problem. He was very good at sourcing, and when he needed to buy it, he would, as he did with his lumber, ran his own plant.
how sustainable do you think the Levitt homes are today? Do you?
That is a great question, and I will say that one of the many interesting stories about Levittown is the people who are returning to Levittown to look at that very question. It's Levittown became kind of outdated because the houses are small, they're close together, relatively speaking. But things kind of fall in and out of fashion. And about 15 years ago, people began to look at Levittown again for what it did right in terms of, if you will, a kind of balanced approach, a sustainable approach to suburban growth, because the lot sizes were quite small. The houses were quite small, and they had, relatively speaking, relatively small footprints compared to, for instance, the McMansions that are being built today. And they were all not all single floor, many single floors, and building on slabs. So actually, I do know of several civil engineers who have been studying Levittown and looking at the ways in which it was perhaps inadvertently sustainable in terms of the way it was built, the kind of systems it put in place, even at radiant heat in the slabs, which was a cost-saving device, is considered to be something that a lot of new home builders are looking at, because it is a more sustainable way to deliver heat to a small building.
So here, I'm going to read this one because I don't want to make sure I get this one wrong. You mentioned the design influence of Wright's architecture. Did you research and uncover any connection between Levitt's prefab manufacturing of the early Sears and Roebuck's company, the honor-built modern homes? Was there any connection?
No, he did. I mean, this could be part of this may be apocryphal, and part of the myth making. And I will say, Levitt and Sons, among other things, they were fantastic promoters. They really were excellent at promoting their product. And Bill Levitt was a consummate salesman. Having said that, when they described their inspiration, the story that Levitt always told is of how his brother Alfred, who was the quiet one, the introverted one, spent a year watching Frank Lloyd Wright build a house on Long Island. He was completely and studied it and became a student. Although Levitt, it's important to know, Alfred Levitt was completely self-trained, and that stylistically he was inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright, and went on record saying, "I want to bring modernist style, architectural style, to the masses," which I think is interesting, because it was a perfect marriage of that style also fit the need for inexpensive housing. Open plan is much cheaper to build than putting up 4 or 5, 6 walls. So it was a really interesting version. But no, I have not seen any connection between that and the prefabricated houses that Common is sort of referencing with Sears and Roebuck. And again, he made a point of saying his houses were not prefabricated. they were fabricated on site. He delivered materials in house portions, but these were not prefabricated houses. They were built on site individually, although in this interesting, assembly line fashion.
So a little bit about Mr. Levitt. Anybody know what his peak net worth was? Where did he live? Think about him himself.
Is that a question to me?
Mhm.
To me? Okay, so I was actually just looked at he died, I want to say in the 1970s, and it supposedly he'd squandered his fortune.
Hmm.
So I don't know how much that he was actually valued at one time, but the story is he went off on a lot of ventures. It's fascinating. I just received an email from someone who was researching a Levitt project in Iran.
Oh.
So somehow in the 1970s, he was in Iran trying to build houses. He went to Florida. He went to France. I mean, he was trying to market this because he had the brand. But as I said, these were very scaled back developments by the time that they were being imported. But I was told that he did not die a wealthy man, and through some bad investments. But I honestly can't address what his actual worth was. I will say there is, I think that Levitt and Sons persists as a corporate entity, but it's not. There's no connection with the original family at all.
So one question, and that was, how can you see the original kitchen?
The original kitchen, you can see it virtually. It's as we say in the museum business, unfortunately, at any one time, what we have in our collections only are 2 or 3% are ever out on the floor. We would love to have that back out on exhibit, and we're always looking for opportunities because it was such a big part of that particular exhibit and such a hit with visitors. I will say, however, we're stylistically recreating part of a kitchen for our upcoming exhibit that will be telling the Daisy Myers story as part of a civil rights exhibit, which is titled "A Place for All: 3 Stories of Integration in Pennsylvania." So if you find this at all interesting, we tell part of the Levittown story with some original artifacts, not the full kitchen, unfortunately, in this upcoming exhibit, and it's going to open here in June.
So on that note, I will include, so if you want to see this virtually, in the email when I send out the registration, I'll include the link to our digital collection, and it'll take you right to those objects. I can send that to you, and I will update you on the upcoming events for the new exhibit. And we're going to say our last question. So Levittown, is there anywhere else in the United States or in Pennsylvania where in the 50s you see some of these communities?
Oh yeah, in fact, interestingly enough, next to Levittown, there's a community called Fairless Hills. You mentioned, if you remember, I mentioned there was a steel plant that was nearby. And that was one of the inducements for Levitt when he was looking for a location for his second development. That was a somewhat similar to Levittown. Again, the distinction, they were prefabricated houses, not on the same scale. I would say you find Levittowns almost everywhere, to the extent that once Levitt begins this and shows this can work, you have a lot of small developers who start building developments that have elements of Levittown, not the full enchilada, as you would say, not the as coherent planned communities, but certainly inspired by a lot of the same type of building techniques, some of the same elements, the orientation of elementary schools, some of the same community features, but none to the same scale. It's highly duplicated though in terms of that technique. So you'll find there's a lot of small Levitts all across Pennsylvania, all across the country.
Well, thank you, Dr. Miner, for joining me today. We appreciate your chat. This went really well. Lots of great questions from our audience.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Those great questions. Excellent.
So once again, thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you back for more of our Learn at Lunchtime programs.